Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Getty Museum virtual event, The Invention of Time, Mechanical Clocks, and the Age of the Manuscript. I'm Larissa Grolemond, Assistant Curator of Manuscripts here at the Getty Museum, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to this conversation with Professor Ellie Truitt. I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge the Getty's presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva, Chumash, and Tataviam peoples, who have been here in what we now call Southern California since time immemorial. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands, waters, and islands. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. And please use the Q&A box to ask questions throughout the program. There will be time for questions, especially at the end of the conversation. So as they occur to you, please pop them into the box. All right, let's go ahead and get started. This program, though it's virtual, complements a real-life exhibition that's now on view at the Getty Center, Transcending Time, the Medieval Book of Hours, that I co-curated with Nava Strider. The exhibition focuses on a particular kind of medieval book, often extensively illuminated, that helped people organize and make sense of time, both on a micro level over the course of a day, and on a macro level related to the huge scope of Christian time, beginning with Genesis and ending with the Apocalypse. But before we get into all of that, let me introduce Ellie Truitt, who's going to help us explore all kinds of medieval chronotechnologies, from codices to clocks. And Ellie, I just have to say that I love the term chronotechnologies. And just by way of introduction, Ellie Truitt is an associate professor of the history of science and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches and writes about medieval science, technology, and medicine. Before beginning at Penn last year, she spent over a decade teaching in the history department at Bryn Mawr College. She did her graduate work in medieval history and the history of science at the University of Cambridge and Harvard University. Welcome, Ellie, and thank you so much for joining me to talk about time.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So Ellie, as I mentioned, books of hours, as their name suggests, are prayer books that contain sets of devotion broken up into smaller chunks, these so-called hours. And these two images are the beginning of the core text of these books, the Hours of the Virgin, which usually are illustrated with scenes from the lives of Mary and Christ. But these are books that were intended for a secular audience, so lay people, regular people. But these prayers were meant to be said in equal intervals throughout the day, kind of in an imitation of the monastic prayer schedule. So my question to you is, how did people know what time it was? Can you give us a little bit of a sense of how people in the Middle Ages told time and how accurate that time telling was?
So that's a great question. And I should say that there are a number of different ways of telling time that have been in use since even before, in some cases, before the medieval period. So one, for example, is there are ways of essentially marking duration. So, for example, candle clocks, which are candles of particular sizes or burn rates that have marked on them particular intervals. And so you would know by how much of the candle had burned, how much time had passed. So that's one type of technology. Sundials are another. That we find even in the ancient world as well. And then we also find technology going back to the Hellenistic period even, that is essentially the same as hourglass technology, but not with the glass. So the idea being that a controlled flow of sand or liquid from one chamber to another would be a way to sort of tell time as well. And then sand glasses themselves appear in Europe in the sort of 14th and 15th centuries. So we have all of those kinds of ways. And then we have kind of related to that are called water clocks, which here's a perfect example of one. The technology for water clocks actually emerges out of Hellenistic technology and really kind of takes root in the area that's now sort of Syria, and parts of Turkey, in which the flow of water from one chamber to another essentially is what tells time. And so that is this essentially the way of marking duration, but they are it's possible to use that flow of water to actually power other things. So in here we have this great image from this picture Bible in the middle of the 13th century, and you can see that the artist kind of has a good sense of how this technology works. In this case, the flow of water helps move a wheel, which itself rings bells at particular intervals. And it's the sound, the aural quality, that actually marks the passage of time for the people there. And this technology entered the sort of Latin Christian West in the 10th century from Islandum and the Byzantine Empire, where often water clocks were combined with really elaborate, spectacular automata, musical automata that really, as well as sort of astronomical complications that were quite sophisticated technologically and horologically as well.
So how widespread would technologies like this have been? Who would have owned a water clock or even a candle clock or a sundial? Like, would this be something that was a technology that was accessible to, say, an everyday person, or is it really just certain classes that have access to this kind of time telling?
So sundials and candle clocks could definitely be much more widely spread. And in the sort of later medieval period, you have essentially portable sundials almost that could be used for sort of travelers, merchants, people who often needed to know kind of what time it was or how much time had elapsed. Things like really elaborate water clocks were often across the sort of medieval world installed in places that were sort of institutional items by and large. There are a couple of exceptions to this, but we have in the historical record, we know, for example, of a really elaborate water clock that was installed outside one of the main gates of the Great Mosque of Damascus. And we also have descriptions of water clocks at several different monasteries in the Latin Christian West as well. This image, though, from this picture Bible, we know that the King of France at this time had a smaller sort of water clock. So it's possible that this may have been, the artist may have in some way sort of known about that. But again, if you're not, I mean, the type of individual that would have one of these would be royalty. Otherwise, these are, I would say, institutional objects.
I'm thinking particularly about books of hours, because really books of hours start to become popular in the 13th century and really take hold in the 14th and 15th as ways for secular people to imitate this monastic prayer schedule. So the idea that you would start praying very early in the morning and then continue praying at really regular intervals throughout the whole day, really even waking up in the middle of the night to pray. And we know that books of hours were owned really by the nobility and royalty, especially these really illuminated versions, but books of hours increasingly are accessible to a whole variety of people, especially in the 15th century. And so is their time telling using their books kind of approximate, or would they have a way of actually telling what time it was throughout the day?
That's a good question. And it sort of depends kind of where and kind of when we are. But I want to just take a step back and kind of contextualize these books of hours within this monastic context of timekeeping. So as you say, right, books of hours are ways for lay people who are not part of monastic institutions, to participate in those activities in what's called the divine office, which are these specific set times of prayers. Most monasteries in the Latin Christian West in the Middle Ages, they may have had different ideas about, what poverty looked like or what manual labor looked like. But the divine office was something that they pretty much all did. And because it takes place throughout the 24-hour cycle, and it's in the rule, like the rule book, this rule of St. Benedict, that you would have to do this, figuring out how to tell time and when was the appropriate time for prayers was really important to these Christian religious institutions. And so they developed a lot of different techniques and technologies for telling time. Everything from, so in the 6th century, we have a Gregory of Tours suggests that you sing a certain number of psalms once you see a certain star appear on the horizon. And so just the act of doing that itself is a way of marking the passage of time. And so once you had sung enough psalms, you would know that it was time to wake your brethren for their prayers. It's also complicated by the fact that we have unequal hours in terms of the amount of daylight changes dramatically. And in fact, St. Benedict accounted for this in his rule by saying that the night prayers, matins, should be shorter in the summer because the days are so much longer and the nights are shorter.
So and it's really about measuring time between things rather than sort of checking something to see what time it is.
I think that's a great way to think about it. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, water clocks we find installed in monasteries pretty early in Latin Christendom in like the 10th century. But it seems like, as far as we know, that it's really within this monastery context, this context of being deeply concerned with, making sure that the time in between your prayers was appropriately measured and parceled out. That it seems like that is the context in which mechanical clocks emerge at the end of at the very sort of the turn of the 14th century. And what mechanical clocks do is they're called that way because they run by a mechanical escapement. And this is a great just diagram. But functionally what they do is they regulate the release of stored energy in regular increments. So if before, timekeeping from burning candles or looking at a sundial or marking the flow of water, these are all continuous processes. They're ongoing. The mechanical escapement is a change in that it is it's a repetitive process, a back and forth. So what usually in the sort of earliest designs, you have these falling weight drives, essentially just a big weight that's up tall, and all of that kinetic energy, as it is released, it gets released regularly through an escapement. The escapement is what allows that energy to escape in a regular manner. And so this escapement here, what happens is it's connected to the falling weight and it sort of oscillates back and forth. And that is what essentially regulates the clock. And that falling weight drive, this is a much more reliable timekeeping device. Water clocks evaporate in the summer, they freeze in the winter. Sometimes they have to be used to put out a fire. We have texts that say that. These are complicated, expensive devices, mechanical clocks, but they're much more regular. They tell time in a more regular fashion, and they can have really elaborate automata on them because of these massive falling weight, these sort of weight drives, and really exquisite and very elaborate astronomical complications. So we have these two great examples here of really quite early clocks.
I was going to say, I find them so interesting because they are so early. I think I'm a medievalist and I don't think of mechanical clocks sort of existing so sort of in such an advanced fashion this early. And so already we have mechanical clocks in the 14th century, and these two examples I think are representative, but they're striking in their size. Can you talk a little bit about how these came about and sort of where they are and who could have had access to them?
Yeah, so these early clocks we see installed in cathedrals or monastery churches. And in part, they need to be large. They're called monumental astronomical clocks, and they need to be large because of that weight drive in order to sort of move the escapement to have enough essentially energy. This later gets converted to springs, but initially it's a weight drive. So they have to be really big. But really again, they come out of this religious, this Christian context, it's not just that, I mean, the idea is that you pray a certain number of times a day as a mark of devotion and sort of religious observance. And clocks come out of that tradition, and they very much participate in that. And monasteries install them as ways to both regulate time and kind of mark that time, but also to further visually demonstrate in all these really striking technological ways a comprehensive view of time. So for example, I'll take the Wells Cathedral clock first, in part because this actually hasn't been renovated very much. So this is very much what it would look like. But you can see it has astronomical signs, it has the hours, it has automata up top. And so it can tell time in kind of multiple time scales: hourly, daily, monthly, yearly, etc. And then the other image of the clock at Notre Dame of Strasbourg, which was originally built in the middle of the 14th century. What we see here is it was renovated in the 16th century. But in the original clock, it also had religious automata, it had bells, it had tables for times for bloodletting. So it really sort of offers a comprehensive picture of the cosmos, the relationship between the human body, the microcosm, and the macrocosm, with these sort of bloodletting tables, for example. And then also a Christian time as well, because it had images of the Virgin Mary, the three Magi, etc. So it's a way that towns and wealthy religious institutions can memorialize essentially and really display a kind of comprehensive performance of Christian time on this personal to the universe sort of cosmological scale.
I'm actually really struck that it's a kind of multi-sensory experience, that you could sort of be in the physical presence of a clock like this and be sort of impressed by its size and scale. But then there are also these things that you can experience in time and motion, like automata and sounds of bells. And I'm curious kind of how, say, the average person who lives in Strasbourg or Wells would have consulted a clock like this. Would they sort of go to it, or was it just a presence? I'm not sure. How would the average person experience a big public clock like this?
Well, I suppose as much as they would experience, the clock in Strasbourg, I mean, it's in the center of town. It's sort of inescapable if you're like going anywhere around it. We also know that one of the automata on the clock at Strasbourg is this incredible rooster. And the rooster and the clock itself and its striking were actually incorporated into passion plays that were performed at Easter, which were performed for the community. So I think an individual's exposure or interaction with these kinds of items can be quite significant, but not perhaps. I think what you're getting at is people interact with these, or they tell time in different registers. So you might have to be very learned in order to understand certain of the complications, the astronomical dials, etc. But in order to just hear the sounds of the bells and know what time it is, or know something that's chimed the half hour, that is available, sort of much more widely available. One of the things that I think is really interesting, though, is that I think the sound, the performance, the sound itself is a way of marking a particular space, the space of the influence of the clock itself. People within the sort of oral ambit of it all become part of the, it sort of defines community through those sounds. And in fact, I believe there's a word for this in Italian called campanalismo.
So you would have sort of a town, everyone who could hear a bell was sort of encompassed by the clock in a way, being sort of a shared timekeeping community, which I think is really nice, actually.
Yeah, and my understanding is that even in sort of 19th century London, this was the case, in the sense of sort of people would, there's a nursery rhyme about this, that which neighborhood you lived in was sort of which clock, sound bell or church bells you heard.
And I was struck by this image of the Prague astronomical clock. And so this is this on the exterior of a building then? So you could see it from the outside? So that's really interesting too, that there are cases where you don't even need to go inside the church or the cathedral necessarily to kind of be a part of this timekeeping community. It's sort of a part of your daily life, maybe as you pass by, or I'm interested in the idea that in some cases only part of the clock was legible or accessible, but then maybe to even smaller communities who could read it at multiple registers would be an even smaller community of people who were kind of sharing in that timekeeping.
Yes, but I do think it's important to, I think one of the things that you see is that, so we see the mechanical escapement essentially sort of appear at this turn of the 14th century, and then mechanical clocks proliferate really quickly over the sort of 14th century, but even within the first quarter of the 14th century. And these are expensive objects, they're complicated, they're difficult to maintain. But I think one of the reasons that, so it's kind of interesting that these like resource intensive objects proliferate so quickly, but I think one of the reasons why they do is for the same reason that we see the sort of more widespread adoption and use of books of hours, which is a push towards a more widely shared, or a desire for a more egalitarian participation in certain aspects of Christianity in the lay community.
Kind of a demand for a more personal relationship with that or process, just, really.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is definitely part of it. And I think where books of hours are still for very much a sort of like very wealthy group of sort of patrons and people who were using them, clocks, though expensive, are more available to more people because of the sort of public or institutional nature of them.
And so a few of the ones we've looked at, they sort of have this very similar arrangement. They're kind of arranged vertically in registers. And so my next question is, why do mechanical clocks, these big public mechanical clocks, look the way they do? Kind of what is informing the arrangement of these hierarchies or these different registers of time?
That's such a great question, because I think it gets at this point that they don't have to look this way. There was no, right, this is a new technology. They could look anyway. And if what you're trying to do is merely mark the passage of time, you do not need, especially the passage of the hours, all you need is a sound, something has a sound. You don't actually need all of these other bells and whistles and complications. So here we have this great image from Al-Jazari's Book of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. So this is a late 12th, early 13th century of the Common Era. A manuscript by a courtier and engineer, right? He has this book of amazing devices that includes things like programmable fountains, all kinds of different sort of engineering devices, trick vessels, mechanical servants, actually, which are pretty spectacular, and incredible clocks. So this, as I said earlier, water clocks in sort of Islamdom were often had really elaborate automata on them, but water clocks that we see in the Latin Christian West just have a bell. So it's kind of interesting that the mechanical clocks end up with automata. But one of the differences, and that we can see this here, so this clock has astronomical complications. You can see the zodiac dial at the top, and then the little windows in the next register are what tell the hours, but they open and close kind of like an advent calendar. And then the birds and then the musicians below, those are a different sort of sonic components to the time telling and the sort of performances. But these are all secular, right? In the Latin Christian West, once mechanical clocks, once the escapement and the falling weight drive make it possible to build, to use that power to power large automata, that's what they start doing immediately. And those, they do that, most of those automata, or not, they're very often have a kind of religious significance to them, even allegorical. There are some that just ring the bell, and those often have a particular regional or local significance, or they become significant.
So we're actually seeing, I think what's interesting is that the tracking of time is not this kind of scientific, disconnected kind of idea. It's not universal, right? So there are ideological components to the way that time is presented and experienced. And so I'm actually struck by how public the clocks are. Are there any instances of private individuals owning clocks? Like I would imagine that kings, dukes, the richest people in Europe who have huge manuscript collections, huge tapestry collections, and are just sort of known for burning money on fancy things, would have one of these in a private room somewhere and like would be inviting guests back to see them. But that's not the case, right?
No, it's so surprising. So the Duke of Burgundy has an entire chateau and palace that has tons of automata in it, and like trick fountains and, you know, an organ and like all kinds of stuff. And he spends just a huge fortune on it, because we have the bills. He could afford anything he wanted, and he doesn't have one of these. So it's, to me, what that suggests is that these are intended for institutional, public facing sort of purposes. They're not private. And so here, right, the bell ringers at the top of Wells Cathedral, right, they become emblematic of the cathedral in the same way that the bell ringers at the top of the clock in Venice become emblematic of Venice. And so there's a way in which these massive machines, these really complex machines, are there to present and define a particular community, a particular image of community, I think, and that time is how that is done.
So right? Really collective experience of time rather than an individualized one. I think that's really interesting because it's so there's instances of obviously rich people owning fancy automata. Can you talk a little bit about this object in particular? It's really interesting, and it's sort of very intricate looking, and looks super complicated, but can you talk a little bit about what this is?
So the astrarium is a timekeeping device, but in a more astronomical vein. And it was made by a clockmaker, but this is just, and it's an early example, and it's quite intricate, and it moved. It doesn't, as you can see, it doesn't have a falling weight drive. So it sort of allows for more, you could manipulate it yourself
Mhm.
in a way. So it doesn't have the same kind of um, automatic quality that a sort of major clock has, but it does allow for kind of presenting kind of different, the sort of different registers of time. But one of the things that I think is fascinating about it is, right, there's no automata. I mean, clocks could look like that. There's
Mhm.
no reason why they, they couldn't. And so to me, the fact that all of these resources were poured into these objects specifically so that they could look the way that they ended up looking means that that was really important.
Mhm. So we talked a little bit about different registers of
Mhm.
time and the kind of the way that these big mechanical clocks kind of compress all these different kinds of time into kind of a single viewing
Mhm.
experience. And books of hours do a little bit of the same thing. So in addition to this daily hours that people were
Yeah.
expected to pray, they also often start with a calendar. So this seems really familiar to us, I think, because it's the same 12-month calendar. It's obviously, you can see here, a different way of denoting the days of the month. Although the months still have the same number of days that we know them to, they're just broken up a little bit different so that this calendar could be perpetual. So you wouldn't need a new one every year
Right.
because that would be expensive.
Mhm.
And so this kind of telling of time in a yearly sense
Mhm.
is embedded with zodiac signs, which are connected to the idea of astronomical time or astrological time. And the images are often labors of the month, so the kinds of activities that you would do seasonally, which
Mhm.
I think books of hours calendars to me always are really interesting in their combination of this kind of devotional aspect, because the calendar is oriented toward saints' feast days. And so there's this idea of perpetual devotion to certain saints. At the same time, you have these kind of seasonal reminders. So this is a December calendar page, and you can see slaughtering a pig for the winter. And it has this sort of lovely practical quality,
Mhm.
but it would have been experienced very personally.
Right.
And often saints can have this kind of personal valence for particular readers and patrons. Another really fantastic example that
Oh.
gives us a peek into the kind of seasonal activities that you would get in a much more kind of elaborate sense here. Um, September and October calendar pages, because this is kind of the season we're in now. So
Mhm.
you should be plowing and sowing, slaughtering ox, and collecting grapes for wine. But then you also, and again, have these embedded zodiac symbols, which we saw on some of the clocks. And I'm curious about the kind of visual overlap or kind of the visual similarities between maybe somebody who owns a fancy book of hours and
Mm.
somebody who is also experiencing a clock like this kind of visual similarity that would allow somebody to kind of see the same information in a clock as in their books and have that kind of experience of seeing time laid out into really different formats.
I really love that. I've never thought about it like that, Larissa. And I think that that's really fascinating and productive. I think that certainly the kinds of, so I'm not, so I'm not an art historian. And so books of hours are somewhat new to me, but I do have, um, there's some manuscripts with astronomical diagrams that
Mhm.
have themselves moving parts, volvels. And so that is a sort of um, visual symmetry that I'm
Mhm.
sort of familiar, that they're absolutely mirroring each other.
This is something I was totally struck by looking at these images of clocks in particular, because I'm more familiar with the manuscript context. And so this idea of time being circumscribed in a circular format was something that
Mhm.
really was interesting to me. So we think of linear time in a certain respect, but then also this idea of returning to the
Yeah.
first of the month, the first of the year.
Mhm.
This is an astronomical table with a Volvel from the Getty's collection that is used for finding out different phases of the moon at different times of year and different times of the month, different days. And I was just so struck by the idea of this kind of revolving time, or this idea of circular time in a way that was very visually similar between these two kinds of technologies.
Absolutely. And I think too, the volvels also allow for a certain calculation aspect,
Mm-hmm.
or they contain in them, they allow you to sort of look to the future, right? In a way that clocks with astronomical complications can also do. And so that they also kind of allow for this, they tell the time in the present.
Mm-hmm.
The Christian automata that say references the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, for example, so they can reference the past. But then with these astronomical calculations that allow for the accurate prediction of future astronomical events, they tell the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of them also have Christian automata that gesture towards the Christian future of salvation.
Mm-hmm. And so thinking a little bit about like the idea of astronomical time and it being sort of encompassing, I was thinking about zodiac signs and how much of a fixture they are in the illumination of calendar scenes of books of hours, and then also how kind of ubiquitous they seem in these clocks as well. So the idea of rotating around the zodiac. And we talked a little bit about the zodiac man when we were planning the conversation, and it just sort of, it really hit home for me, the idea of the zodiac ruling different parts of the body, and this idea that bodies and time are sort of circumscribed by the movement of the planets, the movement of these astrological phenomena, all being bound up in the idea of the passage of time, was really, I think, a fascinating idea. And I wondered if you had thought about that or sort of had any observations to add about that, because I think it's really interesting.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think so, for example, right, the Strasbourg clock has this bloodletting, these kind of tables for bloodletting for like the right time to do that, which again, like Zodiac Man and zodiac signs, they point to this fundamental relationship in this that was believed in this period to exist between the individual person, the human body, and the cosmos, and that there was this really profound and harmonious relationship between them, and that everything that happened in the cosmos was essentially mirrored at a smaller scale in the human body, so that time becomes the sort of astronomical time isn't abstract in the way that perhaps we might think of it as abstract. Astronomical time for medieval people was quite intimate.
I don't know, everyone's been in Mercury retrograde lately,
right,
so I
exactly.
feel like it's on my mind. Maybe it's on everyone else's mind too, but I like this idea of the personal being connected to this kind of big astronomical idea of astronomical time in a way that feels really relevant and kind of immediate for people who are looking at clocks and also thinking about books of hours and the idea of calendars, kind of tracing that time over the course of a year. And this is just a wonderful little GIF of the Volvel in motion. So you can kind of see how interactive something like this would have been, even in book format. And this kind of idea of a multi-sensory experience happening with books. I think in a similar way that it's happening with clocks too, you get this, but it's a much more tactile idea of manipulating these tables to find out. I like your analogy, what's happening in the future. This gives you a little bit of a power to see into the future, that a clock that just tracks the times of day maybe doesn't. And so that, I think, kind of gets us to this idea of big time, or sort of Christian time that you've alluded to a few times, where books of hours also embed, in addition to hours, months, years, you also have this idea that you should be meditating on the scope of Christian time from the creation. And this is from a historiated Bible on the left. And then on the right, an image of the apocalypse, the last judgment from a book of hours. And so books of hours really try to get people to think in terms of this really huge scope of time too. And that was something that struck me with the clocks as well, that you're being encouraged to sort of think in, or the way that a Christian worldview informs the interpretation of those clocks.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that Christianity is a universal religion. That is, it all time is it takes over all time from the beginning to the end. So even though in Christian theology, Christianity wasn't there until the incarnation and the crucifixion and the passion, actually Christianity was there, sort of in its kind of latent form. So these clocks, which arise out of this deeply Christian institutional context and are installed in these Christian institutions and kind of public spaces, are very much, I think, for the purpose of proclaiming and sort of establishing and proclaiming this message of Christian universality, that all time is Christian time. And it is in this kind of larger institutional context as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the context that books of hours are being read and consumed in as well. And so I feel like they're actually two kind of lovely sides of the same Christian universalist coin. It's very public iteration of it, and then also this private iteration of it. So this is the message that's coming through very strongly, very clearly to people in these communities of time. And so, well, that I think leads to a question of who is excluded from that time and who's excluded from those communities. So whose time don't we see in the idea of these big mechanical clocks, the idea of books of hours, kind of what's missing?
So I think first what's missing are the groups of people whose time falls outside of these kinds of Christian institutionalized parameters. So we have plenty of examples of women and women having different ways of marking time, of thinking about time, ways of everything from dating the development of a fetus, sort of the moment of conception and sort of due dates, et cetera, feeding cycles, when to nurse, menstruation. I mean, all of these are very much about intimate, embodied, and necessary kind of, pervasive ways of thinking about time that are completely left off of these machines. They do not get represented.
Yeah, I brought these two images, even though they're biblical or miraculous births, but I think they do give us a little bit of a sense of the actual lives of women and the kind of, I was so struck when you said gestational time and this kind of the timekeeping that you do in private that is not recorded anywhere necessarily, and the ways that maybe goes against even institutional time, or it's just, as you say, unrecorded. And are there other, women is a big community.
Women's a big community.
Left out. Are there other kind of exclusions from this Christian universalist vision of time?
So in Latin Christendom, the sort of other big group would be Jews. And we see clocks installed in plenty of cities and towns with pretty significant Jewish populations. So Strasbourg, for example, one of the sort of earlier clocks, Strasbourg had, so the Ashkenazi Jewish population in Latin Christendom really sort of exploded and flourished over the sort of 12th and then the 13th centuries. And Strasbourg had a really significant community of prosperous Ashkenazi Jews. During the Second Plague pandemic, the Black Death, as it sort of swept through from sort of 1348 over the next several years, there were a number of anti-Semitic pogroms.
Mhm.
And Strasbourg had one of their own, in which the entire Jewish community was either murdered or exiled, essentially. And the significant part of their wealth was confiscated. And this was in sort of 1349. And then their clock gets built in 1352, and it's largely underwritten by the kind of artisanal class of sort of middle class, like artisans and stuff.
Mhm.
And a lot of that wealth had been confiscated, was wealth that had been confiscated from the expelled Jewish community.
Mhm.
And the clock is, it's sort of out on the other side of the cathedral where this clock is, are huge statues of ecclesia, the church, and synagoga, the Jewish faith, kind of captive and sort of broken.
Mhm.
And there's a very particular message there. And we see the same thing in Prague as well, in that automata get added to the clock to signify greed here. And that is a figure, that's an anti-Semitic figure of a Jew. And Prague at this point, when these statues were put on in the sort of 16th and 17th century, had a really vibrant, wealthy, sophisticated, cosmopolitan Jewish community. And the clock in Venice was built and erected, I think, 10 or 15 years before the Jewish ghetto was established, which was the first of its kind in Europe. So I don't think that's I don't believe in coincidences like that as a historian. It seems so these clocks all kind of appear in these cities in moments when there's usually a sort of really vibrant Jewish population and community. And that is a community that is seen as outside of Christian time. And so because they're outside of Christianity, they're outside of time, essentially.
And so that exclusion feels very purposeful and very directed in a way.
Yeah. And it's worth noting too, right, in the image of Al-Jazari's clock, there's two different dating systems. The Jewish calendar has a different dating system. I mean, there are still, right, multiple dating systems. And certainly in the Middle Ages, they were aware too that there was a totally different dating system that was getting used, a different way of thinking about time. And as a way to sort of, universalism is only universal in comparison to what it leaves out.
Mm-hmm.
And so these clocks, I think, are ways of really establishing those boundaries and the sort of terms of Christian universalism.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that seems like as good as a point to end on as any. We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A already, so I'll start going through those. But if there are other questions, just pop them into the Q&A box and we will try to answer them here. So here's a simple one. Have any water clocks survived?
That's a great question. And they haven't, I don't think they've survived intact, but we have parts of them and pieces. And I should say also that you can go onto YouTube and just Google Al-Jazari clock replica, and there are a number of models of those have been made, like fully working models that are pretty spectacular.
We talked about this a little bit, but maybe we can answer a little bit more completely. If wealthy patrons didn't own clocks themselves, did they sponsor their creation for use in public or institutional use?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is sort of sometimes, but actually, I mean, as far as I know, in most instances, it's institutions, it's wealthy, either religious institutions like churches and cathedrals, monasteries, etc., or municipal institutions like guilds
Mhm.
that are underwriting these. Yeah.
So less a personal wealth situation, more a collective one. Again, that's the idea
Yeah,
of
it's
community.
wild. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Interesting. This is a complicated question, but who decided that the day should be segmented into 24 units? Why?
That's a big question, and I'm not going to be able to answer it all. But I mean, that goes, I think, in part back to the Babylonians with
Mhm.
like base 12.
Yeah.
And then kind of just we're still using it.
Mhm. So we saw the example of the castle clock. And so was the Arabic world also an innovator in clock mechanics, design, presentation, and what was their role in influencing the Latin Christian world? And was there kind of a back and forth of technology, or what was the relationship?
That's a great question. So the sort of Arabic speaking world was really innovative technologically when it in terms of automata, um, water clocks in general, new kinds of gears and valves, et cetera, for regulating those water clocks and controlling automata,
Mhm.
but not for mechanical clocks. So mechanical clocks, so the water clock technology itself comes from the sort of Arabic speaking world and comes into Europe, but again, isn't as nearly as kind of complicated. It's much more simple. It's just a bell ring. It's just used to ring a bell.
Mhm.
Um, and when it comes to designing and designing and building automata, the Arab speaking world was incredibly influential on just that they had them, that they knew how to build them, the actual technologies, et cetera. Really, really influential in the Latin Christian West. But the mechanical clock emerges in Latin Christendom, and it doesn't, and then those start to be exported
Mhm.
east, really in about the 17th century.
Yeah.
Once the technology it's possible to make them smaller, so they're a little more transportable.
Right. And so do you see the same kind of community or sort of collective experience of time phenomena outside of the Latin West, or is that something that's really particular to these kinds of clocks?
I think you see the community element in terms of how these clocks are often also installed in kind of public spaces,
Mhm.
attached to religious institutions or near palaces, etc.
Interesting.
You do see more of them because they're not as big. I mean, they're big, but
Mhm.
they're also, they're not as big. You see them in palace contexts as well.
Mhm.
Um, but so communities, sort of specific communities, I guess I would say.
Mhm.
And the iconography on them, the
Yeah.
automata, it doesn't have the same kind of really freighted theological kind of allegorical significance that we
Mhm.
see on these kind of European clocks.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, great. So where do you place the astrolabe in this context?
Oh, that's a good question. So the astrolabe, some would call it a sort of time telling device because it kind of tells you where you are in time, because it tells you where you are. Well, it doesn't tell you where you are in space. It tells you where the space is around you because it arises in a geostatic context.
Right.
Um, a lot of mechanical clocks had mechanical astrolabes on them. Like
Mhm.
once they figured out how to sort of do that, and the astrolabes, the visual rhetoric of the astrolabe, what they look like, you see that essentially transferred onto clocks, and why we get those dials and those astronomical complications that often look the way they do.
Mhm.
Um, and astrolabes emerge much earlier. I mean, again, they go back. I mean, originally probably to ancient Babylonia, but they are the issue with astrolabes is that they're portable,
Mhm.
which is great, and they're a lot cheaper, but they're really hard to use. you need to be trained in how to use them. And more importantly, they are totally useless unless you have an accompanying book of astronomical tables that are cued to the same latitude that your astrolabe is cued to and where you are.
Mhm.
So they're cumbersome.
Mhm. That
is what I'll
actually
say.
provoked an interesting question for me, which was about the maintenance of these clocks. And so we saw several examples which had been renovated or kind of updated over the course of the centuries after they were initially built. Is that something that the city keeps up, that the church finances? Kind of who is funding the maintenance of these big things?
This is a big question.
Okay.
So cathedrals, monasteries, churches, institutions, they will keep them running, and they do capital campaigns,
Mhm.
right? They do fundraising campaigns. There's a great kind of quote that I came across from England in the early 14th century, somebody saying like, we need to do a collection for a clock because everywhere else has a clock and like we need one. And they're just, getting money from wealthy donors.
Mhm. This is a very earthly pursuit also in a way that at the same time the clock alludes to these very big ideas of Christian time, and
Yes.
astrological time is a very practical
Yeah.
sense of having to maintain and build it.
Yeah. When like a guild was undertaking it, I mean, they would sort of undertake the responsibility to keep it going. But the functionally keeping these clocks going was really difficult. And
Mhm.
there are a number of stories, not just from Latin Christendom, but even, I mean, from from Islamdom as well, stories where there's a really talented, amazing clockmaker who designs this incredible object. And after he dies, it falls into disrepair because nobody knows how to keep it going.
It's too good.
It's like, or, only his son knows how to take care of it.
Right.
I mean, that's, I'm not saying that's a legend. I'm saying we have that exact example, that thing happening in multiple times. So that's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll take one more question. There's lots of good ones, but do we have any equivalents to these types of timepieces today? I feel like we're missing something that these clocks evoke. I do think this is interesting because we experience time so individually on our phones, and we have our own personal schedules, our own personal calendars. Is there anything like this today?
That's a great question. In terms of time,
Yeah.
Hmm.
Not really, right? We don't have that kind of same collective. I would say maybe New Year's.
I think that's it. I think New Year's is it.
Yeah.
I think that there are some places that have pretty spectacular clocks.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I'll say is there's a clock at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, England. And it was installed within the last 15 years. And it's public, like anybody passerby can see it. And it has an automaton on it, and it's amazing and really big and flashy and technologically spectacular. And that's like the only one that I could think of that's recent.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting.
I can't
Maybe we're missing it.
Yeah.
We're missing this medieval experience of time in a way.
Mm-hmm. But it's amazing because people watch it. I mean, they love to go past it.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think we are just about out of time. I've refrained from using every time pun that I can think of, so you're welcome. But thank you very much to Ellie for joining me for this very timely conversation. Really enjoyed having you, and this has been such an interesting topic, and really, really great questions from the audience as well. So thank you very much, Ellie.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for tuning in. I've had a great time.
It's been great. And thank you for everyone that tuned in for this virtual event. And please remember to visit getty.edu for information on upcoming programs. And if you're here in LA, the center and the villa are open, so come see us in person as well. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the internet or in person. Thank you very much.